London, in the winter of 1815, was a city dressed in frost and vanity. Gas lamps flickered along the mist-veiled streets, and the carriages that clattered through Grosvenor Square gleamed like obsidian beetles under a pearl sky. The season was at its height, the time when ladies traded innocence for attention and gentlemen measured worth in lineage and polish. On the evening of the Frost Masquerade, the air itself seemed perfumed with anticipation and judgment. Behind the gilded doors of Grosvenor Hall, 1,000 candles dripped their light upon marble floors and silken gowns, and among them stood Lady Lavinia Ashcombe, 22, lovely, uncertain, and quietly afraid. She had arrived at the ball in her aunt's carriage, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. The daughter of a modest viscount, Lavinia was not bred for spectacle but sincerity. Yet sincerity, in London, was a frail currency. Her gown, ivory silk trimmed in pale blue, was fine enough, but it carried the faint air of effort. She lacked the effortless assurance that marked the daughters of dukes and marquises, and though her face was sweet, it was her silence that drew whispers. A beauty of few words, someone had remarked earlier in the season. Perhaps she has little worth saying. But Lavinia's quiet was not emptiness, it was defense. For weeks she had been told that the Duke of Ravenshire, the most eligible man in London, might take interest in her. Her aunt, Lady Meredith, had whispered that he sought not a flirt but a wife of substance. Yet as Lavinia stood beneath the chandeliers, watching the couples glide in perfect rhythm, she wondered what substance truly meant in a world that bowed to appearances. Then the music paused, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Duke had arrived. Sebastian Ravenshire entered with the ease of a man who had never been questioned. At 28, he was tall, dark-haired, and composed in a way that silenced rooms. His fortune was old, his estate vast, his reputation unblemished except for one whispered flaw. He expected perfection and rarely found it. Lavinia saw him before he saw her, and in that instant, she felt both admiration and a strange foreboding. When their eyes finally met across the floor, it was as though the air tightened between them. He approached, not with warmth but deliberation, and when he bowed, the motion was exact. "Lady Lavinia Ashcombe," he said, his voice deep, clipped, unmistakably aristocratic. "I'm told you have recently returned from the country." "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, curtsying. Her voice trembled just enough for him to notice. "I hope you have not forgotten the forms of our society," he said lightly, but there was a shade of challenge beneath his tone. "I fear I never learned them properly to begin with," she answered, attempting grace. He studied her face, intelligent eyes, too candid for this room, and something like curiosity flickered, quickly suppressed. When the orchestra began its next piece, he extended a gloved hand. "Would you honor me with this dance?" Her heart leapt. She placed her fingers in his, and they stepped onto the floor. Around them, eyes turned like petals following sunlight. The waltz began, a swirl of motion, elegance, expectation, and Lavinia tried to find the rhythm she had practiced so often. Yet her nerves betrayed her. A step mistimed, a hesitation too visible. She faltered, caught herself, then faltered again. The Duke's expression did not change, but his hand grew firm, his tone cool. "Steady, my lady." "Ah, yes, Your Grace." A pause too long, a breath too shallow. The music carried on without her. When he stopped, the silence felt heavier than the orchestra itself. He released her hand. "You are not fit to be a duchess," he said quietly, not cruelly, but with the certainty of a man accustomed to pronouncement. His words were not shouted, yet they carried, soft enough to sound intimate, sharp enough to cut through the hum of conversation. For a heartbeat, she did not move. Her cheeks burned. Around her, fans fluttered, whispers slithered, and her aunt's voice, somewhere distant, called her name. Lavinia wanted to speak, to defend herself, but no words came. The Duke turned away, offering no further glance, and another lady, one perfectly composed, took his arm as the orchestra resumed. Lavinia stood amid the glittering crowd, her humiliation complete. But in her stillness, something changed. Beneath the ache of shame, A quiet resolve began to form. Not the desperate wish to please, but the fierce desire to reclaim her dignity. If society demanded grace, she would learn it. If the Duke prized refinement, she would master it. Not for him, but for herself. When she left the ballroom, snow had begun to fall. The city outside seemed softer, the lamplight blurred through the flurries. Her carriage waited, horses steaming, driver dozing. Before stepping inside, she turned once more toward Grosvenor Hall. Through its frosted windows, light spilled like molten gold into the dark. Somewhere within, the Duke was dancing again, effortlessly, as if the world were his instrument. Lavinia's breath clouded in the cold. Not fit, she whispered to herself, the words tasting bitter and strangely galvanizing. The phrase would haunt her, but it would also drive her. As the carriage wheels began their slow grind over the cobblestones, she pressed her gloved hand to the window pane and watched the ballroom's light fade behind her. Inside, gossip bloomed like frost on glass. Outside, beneath the hush of snow, a different story had begun, one not of disgrace, but of defiance. By dawn, the rumor had spread that the Duke of Ravenshire had dismissed a viscount's daughter as unworthy. Some pitied her, others smirked, but Lavinia slept that morning with a curious calm. She had seen herself in his eyes, not the girl he scorned, but the woman she might yet become. And somewhere deep within, she knew, one day, when the music played again, she would not falter. The season's frost glittered over London, merciless and magnificent, as if the heavens themselves watched to see what she would do next. The weeks that followed her humiliation passed in a blur of snow and silence. Lady Lavinia Ashcombe retreated from London to her aunt's estate in Kent, where frost clung to the hedgerows and the river ran sluggish beneath sheets of ice. The city's gossip had already reached her, each retelling sharper than the last. She was the girl who had stumbled in the Duke of Ravenshire's arms, the country lady who had proven unfit for courtly grace. Every whisper found its way to her door, but instead of breaking her, it carved something stronger within. Each morning, Lavinia rose before dawn and crossed the marble corridor of her aunt's manor to the music room, where a cracked harpsichord stood beside a wide mirror. There she began her lessons anew. Her aunt, a practical woman with a soft heart, had engaged an instructor, a retired French maitre named Monsieur Doroche, whose stiff bearing and sharp tongue made even the servants flinch. He had once trained duchesses. Now he was training a disgraced viscount's daughter. At first he regarded her with pity. Then, after watching her move with solemn determination, with growing respect. "You dance as one who fights a duel, not as one who courts applause," he observed on a bitter January morning. "Perhaps I am fighting," she said, pausing to catch her breath. "For what, ma chère?" "For the right to be unashamed." That answer silenced even him. Day by day, Lavinia's grace unfolded like thawing ice. Her steps lost their stiffness. Her balance grew effortless. But what astonished Delaroche most was not her precision, but her sincerity. There was a quiet truth in her movements, a refusal to imitate the hollow gestures of society's belles. She learned the rhythm not from pride, but from feeling, and when she danced alone before the mirror, there was no trace of fear, only focus, and a light that had not been visible before. As winter waned, London began to stir again with anticipation for the coming season. Letters arrived, invitations embossed with gold seals, gossip hidden in their margins. Her aunt urged her to return. "The city forgets quickly," Lady Meredith said over tea one morning. "Show them what time and temperance can do." Lavinia hesitated, then nodded. She was no longer the uncertain girl who had trembled in Grosvenor Hall. The woman who would return to London would not beg for admiration. She would command it by the mere steadiness of her presence. When her carriage arrived at her aunt's townhouse in Mayfair, the city had exchanged frost for blossoms. Carriages rattled along the Mall, bonnets bobbed in Hyde Park, and every salon murmured of engagements and inheritances. Within a week of her return, Lavinia's name was again on the lips of society, not as ridicule, but curiosity. "Lady Lavinia has returned," they whispered, and she looks different. At the season's first musicale, she appeared in a gown of deep emerald silk, simple yet arresting. The murmur that followed her entrance was almost reverent. She did not shrink from the crowd's eyes. She met them calmly, as though she had been born beneath their scrutiny. The Duke of Ravenshire was present that night, standing among his peers, his posture as faultless as ever. When he saw her, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, quickly replaced by something more guarded. He inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than invitation. During a country reel performed later that evening, Lavinia joined the dance. Not a waltz this time, but a lively, unpretentious rhythm that suited her perfectly. Her movements were light and sure, her laughter genuine. It was not the elegance of a duchess that she displayed, but the authenticity of a woman unafraid of her own humanity. Across the room, the Duke watched in silence. He had expected bitterness in her, perhaps desperation. Instead, he saw composure born of quiet strength. For the first time, he questioned the cold certainty that had shaped his judgment. What if refinement was not a matter of breeding, but of character? What if grace was not learned, but revealed? When the music ceased, their eyes met again. She inclined her head faintly, neither deferential nor defiant, merely serene. It was enough to unsettle him. Days later, Lavinia received a note delivered by hand. The paper was of fine quality, the script bold and elegant. "Do not hide your life from the ballroom, my lady." There was no signature, but she knew. The words trembled between reproach and admiration. She folded the letter and locked it away, unsure whether to feel flattered or wary. The season pressed on, and with it came another turn of fate. One February evening, as Lavinia's carriage wound through the countryside toward a charity assembly, a sudden flurry of snow obscured the road. The horses shied, the wheels struck a hidden stone, the axle cracked. The driver shouted, struggling to steady the team. Ahead loomed a stretch of dark pines and a solitary manor rising from the mist, the estate of Ravenshire. Within the hour, a lantern appeared through the snow, carried by a tall figure cloaked in sable. "Lady Lavinia?" The Duke's voice was unmistakable, deep and measured. "You must come inside. The storm is worsening." Pride urged her to refuse, but necessity prevailed. Inside the great hall, the air was warm and heavy with wood smoke. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting long amber shadows across portraits of his ancestors. The Duke poured her a measure of brandy, his movements deliberate. "I did not expect to see you again so soon," he said quietly. "Nor I, your grace," she replied, taking the glass. There was a pause, the kind that hums with unspoken things. He studied her, not as a judge, but as a man newly uncertain of his own verdict. "I wronged you," he said at last. "Not in my words, perhaps, but in the presumption that you could not rise above them." She met his gaze. "You were mistaken, but not cruel. I have learned more from your rejection than I ever could from praise." He smiled faintly, the expression almost human. "You have learned to wound without drawing blood. And you," she said softly, "to apologize without losing pride." Outside, snow fell soundlessly against the windows. The moment lingered, fragile and unclaimed. By dawn, the roads had cleared. When she departed, he watched her carriage vanish into the pale morning. By the week's end, London whispered anew, not of humiliation, but of scandal. They said the Duke had sheltered a lady overnight. They said she had changed him. Neither confirmed nor denied it. But those who saw them next spoke of something altered between them, a gentler distance, a quieter fire. And so the season turned, not with thunder, but with the slow, inexorable rhythm of a waltz waiting to begin again. Not a full year passed before the frost masquerade returned to London, and with it came memories that neither Lady Lavinia Ashcombe nor the Duke of Ravenshire had been able to silence. Society remembered her disgrace as though it were a charming anecdote, softened by time and gossip's appetite for novelty. But for Lavinia, the memory still glimmered like a scar beneath the skin, proof of how deeply humiliation could shape a heart. Yet she was no longer the uncertain girl of that night. She had grown into herself, honed by patience and tempered by purpose. When her reflection met her gaze in the mirror that evening, it was not pride she saw, but composure. The frost masquerade of 1816 promised to eclipse the last, and Grosvenor Hall shimmered brighter than ever beneath the glitter of chandeliers and frost-white garlands. Carriages lined the square, their lamps casting halos through the falling snow. London's elite entered the ballroom draped in silks and feathers, masks concealing their sameness. Whispers of the past year's scandals fluttered like moths around the chandeliers, but Lavinia paid them no mind. She moved through the crowd with quiet assurance, every step measured, every smile deliberate. Her gown was a soft ivory, threaded with silver, so fine it caught the light like snow in motion. The moment she entered, conversation faltered. Heads turned. She greeted familiar faces, some polite, some pointedly curious. To them, her reappearance was audacious, perhaps even triumphant, yet she carried herself as though oblivious to the judgment that buzzed around her. It was the very indifference that made her magnetic. When the orchestra began its opening number, she stood at the edge of the dance floor, her gloved fingers resting lightly against the rim of her fan. She could feel eyes upon her, searching for weakness, waiting for hesitation. But none came. Across the room, the Duke of Ravenshire stood in conversation with an earl, his profile austere beneath the gleam of candlelight. He had changed too. The same composure remained, but there was a subtle weariness about him now, a quiet weight behind his gaze that even his posture could not disguise. A year of reflection had softened the edges of his pride. He had danced, dined, and conversed as always, yet every gesture carried the ghost of that one evening, the moment he had misjudged a woman whose grace had not yet bloomed. When his eyes found Lavinia, the noise of the hall seemed to recede. For a moment neither moved. The orchestra shifted seamlessly into a waltz, and a ripple of excitement stirred through the crowd. An unspoken curiosity, a collective anticipation. Would history repeat itself? The Duke hesitated, then stepped forward, the crowd parting before him with instinctive deference. Lavinia did not retreat. When he stopped before her, she inclined her head, calm and unreadable. "Lady Lavinia," he said, his voice low enough for her alone. "It seems the winter favors your return. Perhaps the frost remembers what it once tried to bury," she replied, her tone even, but her pulse unsteady. He studied her face, then extended his hand. "Will you grant me a second chance, to dance if not to atone?" The murmur that swept the room was like wind through glass. Lavinia's gaze flicked toward the orchestra, then back to him. She hesitated just long enough for tension to gather, then placed her gloved hand in his. "One dance, your grace," she said. "No more, no less." They stepped onto the floor as the waltz began, and for an instant the world seemed to still. Every movement between them was deliberate, cautious, like a conversation carried in rhythm instead of words. Lavinia's steps were measured but fluid. Her body moved with a grace that was neither learned nor performed. It simply was. The Duke followed her lead as much as she followed his, their movements harmonizing in a way that felt almost inevitable. "You have changed," he murmured. "So have you," she said, "but perhaps not enough." He smiled faintly. "You still wound without cruelty, and you still flatter without conviction." Their exchange was soft, hidden within the sweep of the music, yet charged with the weight of all that had been unsaid. Around them, onlookers whispered in disbelief. A year ago, she had faltered beneath his judgment. Now, she commanded the room with quiet dominance. The chandeliers shimmered overhead, scattering light across the polished floor, and for those few minutes, the ballroom ceased to exist as anything more than an echo around their movement. As the music swelled, he tightened his hold, not in possession but in recognition. "I was wrong," he said under his breath. "I thought grace was performance. You have taught me otherwise." She looked up, her gaze steady. "And I thought forgiveness was weakness. You have shown me it is choice." The final note lingered in the air, trembling like breath on glass. When it faded, silence followed, a silence so profound it felt sacred. Then applause erupted, not polite but rapturous. For the first time in memory, the Duke bowed, not as a conqueror, but as a man humbled by admiration. Lavinia curtsied, unflustered, her composure serene even as her heart raced. When they stepped from the floor, 100 eyes followed. Society saw a reconciliation, perhaps even romance. But between them was something deeper and more fragile. Respect born of redemption, the quiet recognition of two people who had faced their own reflections and found each other there. As the night wore on, they exchanged only brief glances, each unwilling to disturb the balance that had finally settled. Yet beneath that restraint lay an unspoken awareness, something between apology and invitation. When Lavinia took her leave near midnight, the Duke watched her go without a word, his expression unreadable. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and unhurried. The carriages gleamed under the gas lamps as drivers called to one another through the mist. Lavinia paused on the steps, her breath visible in the chill. She felt changed, not because he had seen her differently, but because she had learned to see herself clearly. Inside the hall, the Duke remained motionless near the window, watching her carriage disappear into the white. In his chest, something long frozen began to thaw. The night had not ended in confession or proposal, but in understanding, an unfinished waltz that promised one more turn. And as the snow thickened beyond the glass, both knew their story was far from over. The days after the masquerade were filled with restless quiet. London, still echoing with the memory of the frost waltz, hummed with speculation. The newspapers praised the Duchess to be in everything but name. Gossip described how the Duke of Ravenshire had been seen looking upon Lady Lavinia Ashcombe not with the detachment of judgment, but with the gravity of devotion. Yet Lavinia herself avoided society's noise. She withdrew to her aunt's townhouse, taking refuge among the hush of morning light and the calm of unread letters. Each headline, each whisper, felt like the echo of a promise not yet spoken aloud. In the privacy of her chamber, she replayed the memory of that night, the waltz, the murmured words, the look in his eyes when the final note faded. It had not been admiration alone. It had been a reckoning. She had forgiven him long before he knew to ask for it. And in that forgiveness, she had freed them both from the chains of their pride. Still, one truth unsettled her. Love, when it came wrapped in dignity and restraint, could be the most dangerous of all emotions, for it asked not to be declared, but to be understood. The winter deepened once more. Snow returned to London, soft and steady, cloaking the streets in quiet majesty. Invitations poured in for holiday gatherings, but Lavinia declined them all, save one. A sealed envelope arrived, its wax marked with the Ravenshire crest. Inside, a single line written in his hand. "There is something I must say to you before the year is lost." It was not a command, but an entreaty. Her heart answered before her reason did. Ravenshire Hall stood on the edge of the city like a monument carved from twilight. She arrived as dusk settled, the sky painted in bruised violet and silver. The great doors opened before she could lift the knocker, and the Duke himself appeared, not in ceremony, but simplicity, dressed in a dark coat that made his eyes seem almost blue. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them carried all that words had failed to express. "You came," he said quietly. "I could hardly refuse," she replied. "Your letters are difficult things to ignore." A faint smile touched his mouth, though his gaze was solemn. He led her through the grand corridor, its portraits shadowed by candlelight, until they reached the conservatory, a room of glass and silence where snow fell thick against the panes. Beyond the frost-blurred glass, the world was all white and distance. He turned to her then, his composure more fragile than she had ever seen it. "I've spent a year trying to understand the nature of grace," he said. "It is not found in breeding, nor beauty, nor the poise that society worships. It is found in humility, in courage disguised as quiet. And now you speak as a philosopher," she answered softly, though her voice trembled. "No," he said, only as a man who has been wrong and wishes to be worthy of forgiveness. She looked away, her breath clouding faintly in the cool air. Forgiveness you already possess, your grace. But worthiness, that must be earned. He stepped closer. Then tell me how. Her composure wavered. For all her strength, she had never learned how to refuse kindness once it was sincerely offered. Do not seek to earn what is freely given, she whispered. It is not your apology I came to hear. It is your heart, if it speaks honestly. For a long moment, he said nothing. The snow outside pressed against the glass, soft and relentless. Then quietly he spoke. When I told you that you were not fit to be a duchess, I meant that I believe perfection to be the measure of worth. I was blind to what you truly are. You possess not perfection, but truth, and I find I cannot live in its absence. You dance as though you carry the soul of the season itself. I can only hope you will allow me to share in its warmth. Her eyes met his, and whatever tension had lingered between them dissolved like frost under sunlight. He took her hand, not as a claim, but a vow, and sank to one knee upon the marble floor. Lavinia, he said, his voice steady, will you grant me the honor of being the man who learns beside you, who errs, who listens, and who, if you will permit him, loves you openly? The silence that followed felt eternal. The only sound was the faint sigh of snow sliding against the glass. She could have wept for the tenderness in his tone, but instead she smiled, a slow, tremulous smile that carried every memory of pain and every fragment of pride she had shed to reach this moment. I do not wish to be worshipped, she said, nor to be owned. If you seek a duchess to adorn your name, there are many who would oblige. But if you seek a companion who will remind you to be kind when the world demands perfection, then, yes, I will be yours. The Duke rose, and for the first time, he looked uncertain, as though joy itself were too great to contain. He bowed his head and pressed her hand to his lips, reverent and wordless. Through the high windows, moonlight spilled across the floor, casting their shadows in perfect symmetry. Outside, the storm subsided. Inside, time seemed suspended. They stood together, neither speaking, as if afraid to shatter the fragile peace that had finally settled between them. By morning, the snow had stilled. Word spread quickly through London that Lady Lavinia Ashcombe had accepted the Duke of Ravenshire's hand. Society gasped, then celebrated, for nothing delighted them more than redemption dressed as romance. Yet beneath the glitter of congratulations, neither cared for the approval of others. They had found something rarer, an understanding born not from circumstance, but from choice. On their wedding day, snow fell again, gentle as a benediction. As the carriages rolled through the streets, the city paused to watch. The Duke, once the image of untouchable pride, now wore contentment as easily as his title. And beside him, the new Duchess of Ravenshire met the crowd's gaze with quiet grace. London would remember the dance, the scandal, the snowfall, but history would remember something else entirely. They said the Duke had taught her to dance, but those who had truly watched knew the truth. It was she who had taught him how to love.